At the family dinner, my son-in-law laughed. "You don't run anything in this company anymore. Let a real man take care of business." Everyone laughed. But when I placed a contract on the table without saying a word, the color drained from his face instantly. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Melvin, and at 57 years old, I thought I'd experienced every kind of betrayal life could throw at me. I was wrong." The dining room felt smaller than usual that Thursday evening, despite the 14-foot ceilings and the mahogany table that had belonged to my grandfather. Maybe it was the weight of what I was carrying in my briefcase, or maybe it was the suffocating presence of my son-in-law Vincent, who sat at the head of my table as if he owned the place. My daughter Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting on her slightly rounded belly. 5 months pregnant with their first child. She glowed with that maternal radiance that reminded me so painfully of her mother. Margaret would have been horrified by what was about to unfold. Vincent carved the roast beef with theatrical precision, his movements deliberate and confident. Everything about him screamed entitlement, from his perfectly styled hair to his custom-tailored shirt that probably cost more than some people made in a week. At 34, he carried himself like royalty, and unfortunately, my daughter worshipped the ground he walked on. "The quarterly numbers look promising," I said, attempting to steer the conversation toward business. After all, Hartwell Industries was still my company, even if Vincent acted like he ran it. Vincent's laugh cut through the air like a blade. "Oh, Melvin." He set down his knife and fork, leaning back in his chair with that smirk I'd grown to despise. "You really don't get it, do you?" The tone in his voice made my stomach clench. I'd heard it before, usually right before he delivered one of his calculated blows to my dignity. "What don't I get?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want the answer. Sarah's mother-in-law, Patricia, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Vincent's parents had joined us for dinner, along with his younger brother Marcus. The audience was assembled, and Vincent never wasted a performance opportunity. "You already don't run anything in this company anymore," he said, his voice gaining volume and confidence. "It's time to let a real man take charge of the business." The words hit me like a physical blow, but it was the laughter that followed that nearly broke me. Patricia giggled nervously. Marcus actually guffawed. Sarah said nothing, just stared at her plate with that distant look she'd developed over the past year. "Vincent," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest, "I built this company from nothing. 15 years ago, it was just me in a rented warehouse with a $10,000 loan. And look where that got you," Vincent replied, gesturing around the dining room with mock appreciation. "Sure, you've done okay for yourself, but okay isn't enough anymore. This company needs vision, energy, someone who understands modern business practices." The implication was clear. I was old, I was outdated, I was in the way. "I think what Vincent means," Patricia interjected, clearly trying to smooth things over, "is that fresh perspectives can be valuable in any organization. Fresh perspectives. As if 37 years of business experience counted for nothing." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "Vincent's got his MBA from Wharton, after all. He knows about market dynamics and strategic positioning and all that stuff. All that stuff. The empire I'd built with my bare hands, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the risks that nearly bankrupted me 3 times over the years. All that stuff." I looked at my daughter, hoping for some sign of support. Some indication that she remembered who had worked 80-hour weeks to pay for her college education, who had walked her down the aisle just 2 years ago. But Sarah just sat there, one hand on her belly, avoiding my eyes. "You know what your problem is, Melvin?" Vincent leaned forward, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used when he wanted to deliver maximum damage. "You can't accept that times have changed. You can't accept that maybe, just maybe, someone else might be better suited to run this operation." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Everyone was watching me, waiting to see how I would respond to this public execution of my authority. I reached for my briefcase beside my chair. My hands were steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. I'd known this moment would come eventually. Vincent had been circling like a vulture for months, making subtle comments about succession planning and the need for younger leadership. Without saying a word, I pulled out a manila envelope and placed it on the table in front of Vincent. His smirk faltered slightly. "What's this?" "Open it," I said quietly. Vincent's confidence wavered for just a second before he tore open the envelope. His eyes scanned the first page, and I watched as the color drained from his face. The transformation was remarkable. From arrogant certainty to confusion to something that looked suspiciously like panic. "I don't understand," he whispered, but I could see in his eyes that he understood perfectly. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times, each note hanging in the air like a countdown. Vincent's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages, his MBA education apparently failing to help him process what he was reading. Sarah finally looked up from her plate. "What is it?" Vincent's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The man who had just proclaimed himself ready to take over my life's work couldn't form a single coherent sentence. I stood up slowly, feeling older than my 57 years but also strangely liberated. "Dinner's over," I announced to the stunned table. As I walked toward the door, I could hear Vincent frantically shuffling through the papers behind me, his voice cracking as he called my name. But I didn't turn around. Some conversations were a long time coming. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my study, surrounded by photographs and documents that told the real story of Hartwell Industries, a story Vincent had never bothered to learn. The first photo showed Margaret and me standing in front of our original warehouse, both of us grinning despite the mountain of debt we'd taken on. She was 6 months pregnant with Sarah, working 12-hour days doing our bookkeeping, even though morning sickness had her running to the bathroom every hour. We were 26 years old and terrified, but we believed in something bigger than ourselves. That something bigger became Hartwell Industries, a specialty manufacturing company that produced custom industrial components. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary work, and we did it better than anyone else in the tri-state area. Margaret died when Sarah was 16. A heart attack at 43, sudden and brutal and completely unexpected. The doctors said it was a genetic condition we never knew she had. Sarah blamed me for years afterward, convinced that the stress of running the business had killed her mother. Maybe she was right. I threw myself even deeper into work after Margaret's death. It was easier than dealing with the grief, easier than trying to connect with a teenage daughter who looked exactly like the woman I'd lost. By the time Sarah graduated college, we were more like polite strangers than father and daughter. When she brought Vincent home 3 years ago, I was honestly relieved. Here was someone who could make my daughter smile again, someone who could give her the attention I'd failed to provide. Vincent was charming, educated, ambitious, everything I thought Sarah deserved. The first red flag came during their engagement dinner. Vincent had been drinking wine and talking about his vision for expanding our client base into international markets. His ideas weren't necessarily bad, but they showed a fundamental misunderstanding of our business model. "The problem with family businesses," he'd said, gesturing with his wine glass, "is that they get too comfortable with small thinking. You've built a nice little operation here, Melvin, but there's so much more potential if you just think bigger. A nice little operation." The company that employed 47 people and generated $8 million in annual revenue was a nice little operation. I should have spoken up then, but Sarah was hanging on his every word, and I didn't want to spoil her happiness. The pattern continued after their wedding. Vincent would make suggestions about modernizing our processes, about bringing in real marketing consultants, about the need for strategic restructuring. Always with that subtle implication that I was holding the company back. 6 months ago, things escalated. Vincent convinced Sarah to ask me about succession planning. Not in a gentle, let's discuss the future way, but with the urgency of someone who'd been coached on exactly what to say. "Dad, we need to talk about what happens when you retire," she'd said during one of our awkward monthly dinners. "Vincent thinks we should start planning the transition now, while you're still healthy and can guide the process." Vincent thinks. Those 2 words had become the preface to every conversation about the company's future. I agreed to let Vincent take on more responsibilities, partly because I hoped it would help him understand the complexity of what we did, and partly because I was tired of fighting. I gave him access to our financial records, included him in client meetings, even let him sit in on board meetings with our investors. That's when I started noticing the discrepancies. Small things at first. Invoices that didn't quite match our delivery records. Expense reports for business development that seemed excessive. Client payments that took longer than usual to show up in our accounts. I hired Patricia Reeves, a forensic accountant I'd worked with years earlier, to do a quiet audit. What she found made my blood run cold. Over the past 8 months, Vincent had systematically diverted nearly $200,000 from company accounts. He'd set up fake vendors, inflated expense reports, and even created fictitious consulting fees that went straight to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. But the money was just the beginning. Patricia's investigation revealed something much worse. Vincent had been in contact with our biggest competitor, Meridian Manufacturing, sharing proprietary information about our production processes and client contracts. The emails were damning. Vincent had been feeding them intelligence for months, apparently with a promise that he would eventually bring our entire client base with him when he took over Hartwell Industries. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Janet Morrison, our head of human resources, approached me 3 weeks ago with concerns about Sarah's behavior at work. Sarah had been coming in late, leaving early, and seemed distracted during important meetings. "I don't want to overstep," Janet had said, "but she seems different, like she's not really herself anymore." When I pressed for details, Janet reluctantly admitted that she'd overheard Vincent on the phone with Sarah, telling her that she was too emotional to handle important business decisions and that he would take care of everything so she didn't have to worry. Vincent wasn't just stealing from my company. He was manipulating my daughter, isolating her from the business her mother and I had built for her future. That night, 3 weeks ago, I made my decision. If Vincent wanted to play games, I would show him what a real strategist looked like. The documents I'd placed on the dinner table weren't just evidence of his theft and betrayal. They were something much more powerful. A contract Vincent himself had signed just 2 weeks earlier. He'd been so eager to formalize his expanding role in the company that he'd signed the papers without reading them carefully. The contract, which he believed gave him increased authority and a clear path to eventual ownership, actually accomplished something entirely different. Every signature, every initial, every seemingly innocuous clause had been crafted by the best corporate attorney in the state. Vincent thought he was signing his coronation papers. In reality, he'd just signed his own termination notice. But that wasn't the best part. The contract also included a detailed confession of his activities, disguised as a comprehensive disclosure of all business activities and financial arrangements. Vincent had unknowingly documented every aspect of his fraud in his own handwriting. As I sat in my study that night, looking at the photo of Margaret holding baby Sarah, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of protecting what mattered most. Vincent had mistaken my grief and guilt for weakness. He'd confused my love for my daughter with stupidity. He was about to learn the difference between a nice little operation and a business run by someone who'd survived 37 years in the manufacturing industry. The phone rang at exactly midnight. Vincent's name appeared on the caller ID. I smiled and let it go to voicemail. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I drove to the office earlier than usual. I needed to be there before Vincent, needed to set the stage for what was coming. The parking lot was empty except for Janet's Honda Civic. She always arrived by 6:30 to prepare for the day ahead. Vincent's voicemail from the night before had been exactly what I'd expected, confused, angry, demanding an immediate meeting to clear up this misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding. There was only the truth, finally coming to light. I unlocked my office and spread the contents of my briefcase across the mahogany desk that had belonged to my father. 3 manila folders, each meticulously organized and labeled. Folder 1 contained Patricia Reeves's forensic audit. Every stolen dollar documented with bank records, forged invoices, and email trails. Folder 2 held the correspondence between Vincent and Meridian Manufacturing, including detailed discussions about our proprietary manufacturing processes and client contracts. Folder 3 was perhaps the most damaging. Recordings. For the past 6 weeks, I'd worn a small digital recorder to every meeting with Vincent. It was perfectly legal. North Carolina is a one-party consent state, and it had captured Vincent in his own words discussing his plans to restructure the company once he took control. In one particularly revealing conversation from just 10 days ago, Vincent had outlined his strategy to a colleague over lunch. I'd happened to be eating at the same restaurant and positioned myself close enough to record their discussion. "The old man doesn't have a clue," Vincent had said, cutting into his steak with obvious satisfaction. "He thinks I'm learning the business, but I'm really just cataloging everything worth taking. Once Sarah has the baby and gets all emotional about providing for her family, it'll be easy to convince her that Daddy needs to step down for his own good." His lunch companion, someone from his MBA program, had laughed. And then you just walk into Meridian with the whole client list? Not just the client list, Vincent had replied. I'll have their manufacturing specs, their pricing structures, their supplier contacts, everything. Hartwell Industries will be finished within 6 months. The recording was crystal clear. Vincent's voice, his plan, his complete betrayal of everything Margaret and I had built. At 7:15, I heard the familiar sound of Vincent's BMW pulling into the parking lot. He always parked in the spot closest to the building, even though it was technically reserved for visitors. Small acts of entitlement that should have warned me about bigger problems. His footsteps echoed down the hallway with unusual urgency. When he burst through my office door without knocking, his face was flushed and his expensive shirt was wrinkled, as if he'd slept in it. "Melvin, we need to talk about last night," he said, barely controlled panic in his voice. "I think there's been some kind of mistake with those documents." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Please sit down." "I don't want to sit down. I want to know what the hell that contract actually says, because the legal language is confusing and—" "Vincent," my voice was quiet but firm. "Sit down." Something in my tone must have penetrated his agitation because he finally took the chair, though he perched on the edge as if ready to bolt. I opened the first folder and placed Patricia's audit summary in front of him. "Let's start with this." Vincent's eyes scanned the page, and I watched his face go through the same transformation as the night before. Confusion, recognition, then pure terror. "I can explain this," he said quickly. "Some of these expenses were legitimate business costs, and if there were accounting errors—" $217,412, I said calmly. "That's not an accounting error, Vincent. That's systematic theft." He was shaking now, actual tremors running through his hands. "You don't understand the complexity of modern business operations. Some of these transactions were investments in future growth opportunities." I opened the second folder and placed the Meridian correspondence on top of the audit. Vincent's voice died in his throat. "This email is particularly interesting," I said, pointing to a message dated just 2 weeks earlier. "You're discussing our new titanium alloy process with their head of manufacturing. That process took us 3 years to develop and cost us nearly $500,000 in research and development." Vincent's mouth opened and closed without sound. The confident MBA graduate who'd been lecturing me about modern business practices looked like a child caught stealing candy. "But this one," I continued, pulling out another email. "This is my personal favorite. You're telling them that our biggest client, Morrison Aerospace, is unhappy with our delivery times and might be looking for a new supplier. Funny thing is, Morrison called me yesterday to extend our contract for another 3 years. They're extremely satisfied with our work." "Melvin, listen." "No, Vincent, you listen." I leaned back in my chair, finally allowing myself to enjoy this moment. "For 8 months, you've been stealing from my company, selling our secrets to our competition, and manipulating my daughter. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" The office fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and Vincent's labored breathing. Outside, I could hear other employees arriving for work, starting another normal day at Hartwell Industries. They had no idea their jobs had been in jeopardy, that everything they'd worked for had nearly been sold out by the man sitting across from me. "How long have you known?" Vincent asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I started getting suspicious 4 months ago when our profit margins started shrinking despite increased sales, but I didn't have proof until Patricia finished her audit 6 weeks ago." "6 weeks?" Vincent's head snapped up. "You've known for 6 weeks and you didn't say anything?" I smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I wanted to see how far you'd go. I wanted to document everything, make sure there were no loose ends, no possibility of you claiming this was all some misunderstanding." Vincent was beginning to understand the scope of his situation. "The contract I signed transfers all your current responsibilities to other employees and revokes any authority you thought you had," I confirmed. "It also includes your written acknowledgement of all the activities Patricia documented in her audit." I didn't know what I was signing. "That's what makes it so perfect," I said. "A Harvard MBA who signs important documents without reading them. What does that say about your business acumen?" Vincent shot to his feet, his chair rolling backward into the wall. "You can't do this. Sarah will never forgive you." For the first time since this conversation started, I felt a flicker of genuine emotion. Sarah, my daughter who was carrying Vincent's child, who believed she'd found her Prince Charming. "Sarah deserves the truth," I said, "and she's going to get it." Vincent's panic transformed into something uglier, desperation mixed with rage. If you try to turn her against me, I'll make sure she never speaks to you again. I'll tell her you're a bitter old man who can't stand to see her happy." I reached for the third folder. "I don't think you're in a position to make threats." The recordings were organized chronologically, each one labeled with date, time, and location. I selected the one from the restaurant conversation and placed the small digital player on my desk. "The old man doesn't have a clue." Vincent's voice filled the office, tinny but perfectly clear through the small speaker. Vincent's face went white as his own words condemned him. The recording played for almost 10 minutes, documenting his complete plan to destroy Hartwell Industries and everything Margaret and I had built. When it finished, the silence stretched between us like a chasm. "You recorded me without permission," he said weakly. "North Carolina is a one-party consent state," I replied. "Perfectly legal." Vincent slumped back into his chair, the fight going out of him as he finally understood that every avenue of escape had been blocked. I'd spent 6 weeks building an airtight case against him, documenting every crime, every betrayal, every lie. "What do you want?" he asked. I closed the folders and stacked them neatly on my desk. "I want you gone, Vincent. Out of my company, out of my family, out of my life. And if I refuse?" I picked up my phone and placed it next to the folders. "Then I call the district attorney's office and file criminal charges for embezzlement, corporate espionage, and fraud. The evidence speaks for itself." Vincent stared at the phone as if it were a loaded gun. "Sarah's pregnant. You can't destroy the father of your grandchild. You should have thought about that before you decided to steal from the company that will provide for that child's future." The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 8 times. The workday was officially beginning, and employees were settling into their routines throughout the building. Normal people doing honest work, unaware that their livelihoods had been hanging in the balance. Vincent stood up slowly, his movements those of a much older man. "How long do I have?" "You have until the end of business today to clear out your office and turn in your company credit cards, keys, and any other Hartwell Industries property in your possession." "And Sarah?" I met his eyes directly. "Sarah will learn the truth, all of it. But that conversation will happen between her and me without your manipulation or interference." Vincent walked to the door, then stopped with his hand on the knob. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've just done to your own family." "I've saved my family," I replied. "From you." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving me alone with the evidence of his betrayal spread across my desk. Through the window, I could see him walking across the parking lot to his BMW, his shoulders slumped in defeat. In a few hours, I would have to tell Sarah everything. I would have to watch her heart break as she learned who she'd really married. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. Hartwell Industries was safe, Margaret's legacy was protected, and Vincent's threat to everything we'd built was finally over. Sarah arrived at my office at 2:30 that afternoon, her face streaked with tears and her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. Vincent had called her, of course. I'd expected that. What I hadn't expected was the raw pain in her eyes when she looked at me. "Tell me it's not true," she said before she even sat down. "Tell me Vincent is lying about whatever you think you found." My heart broke a little more with each word. This was my daughter, 6 months pregnant, begging me to tell her that her husband wasn't the man I'd proven him to be. "Sit down, sweetheart," I said gently. "Don't call me sweetheart." The anger in her voice surprised both of us. "Vincent said you've been spying on him, recording private conversations, making up lies about stolen money. He said you can't stand that he's smarter than you, that he has ideas you're too old to understand." I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling every one of my 57 years. Vincent had gotten to her first, planted his version of events, painted himself as the victim of my jealousy and paranoia. "Sarah, I need you to look at some things," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "After you see the evidence, you can make your own decisions about what's true." She remained standing, arms crossed over her growing belly in a protective gesture that reminded me painfully of Margaret during her own pregnancy. "Evidence?" Sarah's voice cracked. "You mean the fake documents Vincent says you had someone create to frame him?" "They're not fake." I opened the first folder and pulled out Patricia Reeves's business card. "Do you remember Patricia? She did our annual audit for 5 years before she started her own forensic accounting firm." Sarah's defiance wavered slightly. She did remember Patricia, had even helped her organize files during summer breaks in college. I hired Patricia to review our financial records after I noticed some irregularities. I continued. This is what she found. I placed the audit summary in front of her, watching as her eyes scanned the columns of numbers. Each line item represented money Vincent had stolen, documented with bank records and canceled checks. This says Vincent took over $200,000, Sarah whispered. $217,412 to be exact. I pulled out supporting documents, spreading them across the desk like pieces of a puzzle. Here's the fake consulting company he created. Here are the inflated expense reports. Here's the offshore account where the money went. Sarah's legs gave out and she sank into the chair, the papers trembling in her hands. There has to be an explanation. Maybe he was making investments for the company, or Sarah. I reached across the desk and gently took her hand. Look at the dates. The money started disappearing right after your wedding, when I gave him access to our financial systems. She pulled her hand away as if I'd burned her. You're saying he married me to steal from you? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to face. I could see the moment when doubt crept into her eyes, when the foundation of her marriage began to crack. I'm saying the evidence speaks for itself, I said carefully. But there's more. I opened the second folder and placed the Meridian correspondence on top of the audit. Sarah's gasp was audible when she saw the company letterhead. Our biggest competitor, she said, understanding immediately. Vincent has been sharing our proprietary information with them for months. Manufacturing processes, client lists, pricing structures, everything they would need to put us out of business. Sarah read through the emails with growing horror, her face pale in the afternoon light streaming through my office windows. When she reached the message about Morrison Aerospace, she looked up at me with confusion. But Morrison just signed a 3-year extension with us, she said. Exactly. Vincent told Meridian that Morrison was unhappy and looking for a new supplier. He was lying to them, just like he was lying to us. Why would he lie to both sides? It was an intelligent question, and it showed that Sarah was beginning to think like the businesswoman Margaret and I had raised her to be. Because he wasn't planning to help Meridian succeed, I explained. He was planning to take everything valuable from both companies and start his own operation. Our clients, their manufacturing capabilities, all of it. Sarah set the emails down with shaking hands. I feel sick. There's one more thing, I said, reaching for the digital recorder. And this is the hardest part. I played the restaurant conversation, watching Sarah's face crumble as she heard her husband's voice describing his plan to manipulate her emotional state after the baby was born. When Vincent's recorded voice referred to me as the old man who doesn't have a clue, Sarah actually flinched. The recording ended, leaving us in silence except for the sound of Sarah's quiet crying. He called me this morning, she said finally, her voice thick with tears. He said you were jealous of his success, that you couldn't handle having a younger man show you how business really works. He said you were trying to destroy our marriage because you can't stand to see me happy. What do you think now? I asked gently. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture I remembered from her childhood when she'd fallen off her bike or scraped her knee. I think my husband is a stranger, she whispered. I think I don't know the man I married at all. We sat in silence for several minutes while Sarah processed everything she'd learned. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but empty reassurances wouldn't help her now. She needed time to absorb the magnitude of Vincent's betrayal. The contract he signed, she said suddenly. What did it actually do? It terminated his employment and revoked any authority he had in company operations. It also included his written acknowledgement of all the financial irregularities Patricia documented. He signed a confession without reading it. He was so eager to formalize his power grab that he didn't bother with the details. His Harvard MBA apparently didn't include courses on reading comprehension. Sarah almost smiled at that, then caught herself. This isn't funny, Dad. I'm having his baby. How am I supposed to raise a child with someone who would steal from my family? The word dad hit me like a physical blow. She hadn't called me that in over a year, not since Vincent had started referring to me as Melvin or your father in conversations. You're not alone in this, I said. Whatever you decide to do about your marriage, you and the baby will always have a place here. Vincent said you'd try to turn me against him. He said you'd use the pregnancy to manipulate me into choosing sides. I'm not asking you to choose sides, Sarah. I'm asking you to choose truth over lies, honesty over manipulation. Vincent made his choices when he decided to steal from us and sell our secrets to our competitors. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where Vincent's BMW was no longer parked. Where is he now? I gave him until end of business today to clear out his office and return all company property. He left around noon. Did he say anything? About me? About the baby? I considered lying, protecting her from Vincent's final, cruel words about making sure she never spoke to me again. But Sarah deserved the truth. All of it. He threatened to turn you against me if I exposed his crimes. He said he'd convince you that I was a bitter old man who couldn't stand to see you happy. Sarah's reflection in the window showed tears streaming down her face again. How did I not see it? How did I marry someone capable of this? Because he's very good at manipulation, I said. Vincent showed you exactly what you wanted to see, a successful, ambitious man who could give you the life you deserved. He studied you, learned what you needed to hear, and became that person. But it was all fake? I thought about the question carefully. I think Vincent is capable of genuine feelings, but I also think he's incapable of putting anyone else's needs ahead of his own. He may have loved you in his way, but he loved the opportunity you represented even more. Sarah turned from the window and faced me directly. What happens now? That depends on what you want to happen. I can file criminal charges against Vincent, or I can simply let him disappear from our lives. Either way, he's no longer employed by Hartwell Industries, and he has no access to company information or resources. And our marriage? That's between you and Vincent. But Sarah, I need you to understand something. I stood up and walked around my desk to face her. Whatever Vincent told you about me being jealous or threatened by him, none of that is true. I was relieved when you brought him home because I thought he could make you happy in ways I never could. I wanted him to succeed, both for your sake and for the company's future. Then why didn't you just talk to him when you first suspected something was wrong? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for weeks. Because I hoped I was wrong, I admitted. And because when I realized I wasn't wrong, I knew Vincent would try to manipulate the situation to make himself look like the victim. I needed ironclad proof of what he was doing. Sarah nodded slowly, finally understanding the position I'd been in. You protected the evidence so he couldn't deny it. I protected our family's future, I said. Vincent would have destroyed everything your mother and I built. Everything we wanted to leave for you and your children. Sarah's hand went to her belly instinctively. Our children. Vincent's child. Vincent's child will always be my grandchild, I said firmly. Whatever happens between you and Vincent, that baby is part of our family. For the first time since she'd arrived, Sarah smiled. It was a small, sad smile, but it was genuine. I need to go home and think, she said. I need to figure out what I'm going to say to Vincent when he comes back. Take all the time you need, and Sarah, whatever you decide, I'm proud of you for listening to the truth even when it was painful to hear. She hugged me then, really hugged me for the first time in months. I could feel her trembling with exhaustion and emotional overload, but I could also feel her strength returning. I love you, Dad, she whispered. I love you too, sweetheart, I replied, meaning it more than I'd ever meant anything in my life. As Sarah left my office, I knew the hardest part was still ahead of her. She would have to confront Vincent, make decisions about their marriage and their future. But at least now she was making those decisions with full knowledge of who Vincent really was. The truth had finally set us all free. The next 72 hours unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of consequences. Vincent, it turned out, was not going to accept his defeat gracefully. The first sign of his desperation came at 6:15 Friday morning. I was in my kitchen, making coffee and reading the newspaper, when my phone rang. Vincent's name appeared on the caller ID, and against my better judgment I answered. Melvin, we need to talk. His voice was strained, lacking the confident arrogance I'd grown accustomed to. I've been thinking about everything, and I realized there may have been some misunderstandings about my business activities. There were no misunderstandings, I replied calmly. Everything is documented, Vincent. Your theft, your corporate espionage, your plans to destroy my company. Look, maybe some of my methods were unconventional, but everything I did was intended to help Hartwell Industries grow. Sometimes you have to take risks, make bold moves. Vincent. I set down my coffee cup and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Margaret had planted 20 years ago. Stop. Just stop. We both know exactly what you did and why you did it. This conversation is pointless. There was a long pause before Vincent spoke again, and when he did, his voice had changed. Gone was any pretense of cooperation or remorse. What remained was pure venom. You have no idea what you've done, he said. Sarah is devastated. She's not eating, barely sleeping. The stress you've caused could harm the baby. The accusation hit its intended target. I felt a stab of guilt, followed immediately by anger at Vincent's manipulation. Even now, facing the consequences of his own actions, he was trying to use my love for Sarah and my unborn grandchild as weapons against me. Sarah is upset because she discovered her husband is a thief and a liar, I said, not because I exposed the truth. The truth? Vincent laughed, but there was no humor in it. Your truth is based on some accountant's interpretation of legitimate business expenses and a few private emails taken out of context. Any lawyer could tear your so-called evidence apart in 5 minutes. Then hire one, I suggested. File a lawsuit. Challenge the audit in court. See how that works out for you. The silence stretched between us, and I could almost hear Vincent calculating his options. He knew as well as I did that any legal challenge would only draw more attention to his crimes, create more opportunities for scrutiny he couldn't afford. I want to see Sarah, he said finally. She's my wife. You can't keep me away from her. I'm not keeping you away from anyone. Sarah is an adult who can make her own decisions about who she wants to see. She won't take my calls. She won't answer the door when I come to the house. I felt a flicker of surprise. Sarah hadn't told me she was avoiding Vincent, but I supposed I shouldn't have been shocked. Learning that your husband is a criminal tends to complicate marital communications. Maybe she needs time to process what she's learned, I said. What she's learned is a pack of lies designed to destroy our marriage. Vincent's composure was completely gone now, his voice rising to near shouting levels. You couldn't stand that she chose me over you, so you manufactured this whole conspiracy to break us up. The accusation was so absurd, so divorced from reality, that I almost laughed. But beneath Vincent's desperation, I could hear something darker, a dangerous instability that worried me. Vincent, I'm going to give you some advice, I said. Accept what's happened and move on. Find another job, another city, another life. Stop trying to salvage something that was built on lies from the beginning. Go to hell, Melvin. The line went dead. 2 hours later, Janet Morrison knocked on my office door with a concerned expression and a manila envelope in her hands. This was delivered by courier, she said. The delivery man said it was urgent. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of letterhead from Blackwood, Stevens & Associates, one of the most expensive law firms in the state. The letter was brief and to the point. Vincent was demanding immediate reinstatement to his position at Hartwell Industries, claiming that his termination was illegal and discriminatory. If I didn't comply within 48 hours, he would file a wrongful termination lawsuit seeking damages in excess of $5 million. I showed the letter to my own attorney, David Reeves, Patricia's younger brother and one of the sharpest corporate lawyers I'd ever worked with. David read it twice, then shook his head with what looked like professional admiration. This is actually pretty clever, he said. Vincent can't challenge the evidence of his theft without admitting to the crimes, so instead he's claiming that your investigation was improper and that his termination violated his due process rights. Can he win? Not a chance, David said confidently. But he can make your life difficult for 6 months to a year while the case winds through the courts. Legal fees, depositions, negative publicity. It's a nuisance lawsuit designed to force you into a settlement. What kind of settlement would he want? Money, probably. A severance package large enough to set him up somewhere else, along with a non-disclosure agreement that prevents you from sharing the evidence of his crimes with future employers. I thought about Vincent's strategy. He couldn't undo what he'd done, but he could try to profit from his crimes one last time by extorting money from me in exchange for disappearing quietly. What do you recommend? I asked. David smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. We call his bluff. File criminal charges for embezzlement and corporate espionage. Let him explain his innocence to a prosecutor instead of trying to intimidate us with frivolous lawsuits. Won't that make things harder for Sarah? Sarah's going to have to deal with the truth about Vincent eventually, David said gently. The question is whether she deals with it now while she has some control over the situation, or later, when Vincent's legal problems become public record anyway. That evening, I drove to Sarah's house, the house I'd helped her and Vincent buy 2 years ago with a down payment loan that Vincent still hadn't repaid. Sarah's car was in the driveway, but Vincent's BMW was nowhere to be seen. Sarah answered the door in sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were clear and determined. "I was wondering when you'd come by," she said, stepping aside to let me enter. The living room looked like someone had been camping there for days. Blankets and pillows were scattered across the couch, along with empty water bottles and the remnants of several takeout meals. "Vincent's been staying at a hotel," Sarah explained, following my gaze. "I asked him to leave yesterday morning after we had a conversation about your evidence. How did that go?" Sarah sat down heavily on the couch, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. "About as well as you'd expect. First he denied everything, then he claimed it was all misunderstandings, then he accused you of framing him out of jealousy. Do you believe him?" "I wanted to," Sarah admitted. "I spent 2 days trying to find innocent explanations for everything you showed me. But the evidence is too clear, too detailed. Vincent stole from us, and he was planning to destroy the company." I sat down beside her, feeling relief mixed with sadness. Relief that Sarah could see the truth, sadness that she was having to face it while carrying Vincent's child. "He hired a lawyer," I said. "He's threatening to sue me for wrongful termination." Sarah's head snapped up. "He what?" I showed her Vincent's legal threat, watching her expression harden as she read the demands for reinstatement and damages. "He's still trying to get money from us," she said, her voice flat with disbelief. "Even after everything that's happened, he's still trying to find a way to profit. My attorney thinks we should file criminal charges. It would end Vincent's lawsuit and ensure he faces real consequences for what he did." Sarah was quiet for a long time, one hand resting on her growing belly. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and resolved. "Do it," she said. "File the charges." "Sarah, you need to understand what that means. Criminal charges would become public record. Vincent would likely face jail time if he's convicted. Your child's father would be a convicted felon." "My child's father is already a thief and a liar," Sarah replied. "At least this way, there will be consequences for his actions." "And your marriage?" Sarah pulled off her wedding ring and set it on the coffee table. The simple platinum band caught the lamplight, a symbol of promises that had never been real. "I called a divorce attorney this morning," she said. "I'm filing for dissolution of marriage on grounds of fraud. Vincent married me under false pretenses, and he's been lying to me since the day we met." I felt a surge of pride at my daughter's strength, mixed with grief for the pain she was enduring. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I said. "I'm sorry you're going through this, especially now." "I'm not sorry," Sarah said firmly. "I'm angry. I'm hurt. I'm scared about being a single mother. But I'm not sorry that you exposed the truth. Vincent would have destroyed our company and taken everything we had. At least now our child will have something to inherit." The next morning, David Reeves and I met with Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh at the county courthouse. Jennifer was a tough, no-nonsense prosecutor who specialized in white-collar crime. She reviewed Patricia's audit and the evidence of Vincent's corporate espionage with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen every type of financial fraud imaginable. "This is a solid case," she said finally. "Embezzlement, computer fraud, conspiracy to commit corporate espionage. We could probably add identity theft for the fake vendor accounts. Your son-in-law is looking at serious jail time." "How serious?" I asked. "With his cooperation and a guilty plea, maybe 18 months to 2 years. If he fights it and loses at trial, could be 5 to 7 years. David nodded with satisfaction. "What about his lawsuit against Mr. Hartwell?" "Won't survive the criminal charges," Jennifer said. "Hard to claim wrongful termination when you're pleading guilty to embezzling from your employer." 3 days later, Vincent was arrested at his hotel room on charges of embezzlement, computer fraud, and conspiracy. The local newspaper ran a small story about the arrest, but it barely registered in the community news cycle. Sarah filed for divorce the same day, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting full custody of their unborn child. Vincent's attorney tried to negotiate a plea bargain that would include reduced charges in exchange for a full confession and restitution of the stolen money. But Vincent, true to form, refused to accept responsibility for his actions. He maintained his innocence, blamed me for orchestrating a conspiracy against him, and demanded a trial to clear his name. He would get his trial, and with it, he would get exactly the public humiliation and consequences he'd spent months trying to avoid. Sometimes justice arrives quietly, through careful planning and methodical preparation. Other times, it arrives with handcuffs and newspaper headlines. Vincent had chosen which version he preferred. 6 months later, I stood in the nursery that Sarah and I had decorated together, holding my granddaughter Emma for the first time. She was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and Margaret's distinctive nose. Sarah had insisted on naming her Emma Margaret Hartwell, dropping Vincent's surname entirely. Vincent had been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison after being convicted on all charges. His trial had lasted 3 weeks, during which every detail of his theft and betrayal became public record. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding him guilty. His Harvard MBA and expensive suits hadn't impressed them nearly as much as Patricia's meticulous documentation of his crimes. The restitution hearing had been almost anticlimactic. Vincent had already spent most of the stolen money, but his remaining assets, including his BMW and the expensive watch collection he'd bought with our money, were liquidated to partially repay what he'd taken. The final amount recovered was $73,000, a fraction of what he'd stolen, but enough to send a message. More importantly, Vincent's conviction had ended any leverage he might have had over Sarah or our family. His parental rights had been automatically suspended upon his felony conviction, and Sarah's divorce had been finalized without contest. Vincent was legally and permanently removed from our lives. "She's going to be spoiled rotten," Sarah said from her hospital bed, watching me awkwardly navigate the basics of infant care. "You realize that, right?" I smiled, adjusting Emma's tiny pink hat. "That's what grandfathers are for." The past 6 months had been a period of healing and rebuilding for both Sarah and me. Without Vincent's toxic influence poisoning every conversation, we'd rediscovered the close relationship we'd shared before Margaret's death. Sarah had moved back into her childhood bedroom during the final months of her pregnancy, and we'd spent countless evenings talking about the future, both hers and the company's. "I've been thinking about your offer," Sarah said carefully. 3 months earlier, I'd asked Sarah to consider taking over as CEO of Hartwell Industries when she was ready. She had an MBA from Duke, 10 years of experience in various aspects of the business, and most importantly, she understood the values and principles Margaret and I had built the company on. "There's no pressure," I said. "You have a new baby to focus on, and I'm not planning to retire tomorrow, but when you're ready, the position is yours if you want it." Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching Emma sleep in my arms. "I want it," she said finally. "Not right away, but eventually. I want to build something for Emma, the way Mom and you built something for me." "Your mother would be so proud," I said, meaning every word. The company had not only survived Vincent's attempted sabotage, but had actually grown stronger. The security improvements we'd implemented after discovering his theft had revealed other inefficiencies in our systems. Patricia Reeves had agreed to join us as our permanent chief financial officer, bringing her forensic accounting expertise to bear on every aspect of our operations. Most satisfying of all, our former competitor, Meridian Manufacturing, had suffered significant losses when their attempts to steal our clients fell apart. Without Vincent's inside information, their aggressive expansion plans had failed spectacularly. They'd been forced to lay off 30% of their workforce and close 2 facilities. I felt no sympathy for them. They'd been willing partners in Vincent's betrayal. "Dad," Sarah said, interrupting my thoughts, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest." I settled into the chair beside her bed, still holding Emma. "What is it? Do you blame yourself for not seeing through Vincent sooner? For letting him get as far as he did?" It was a question I'd asked myself countless times over the past months. Could I have prevented Vincent's theft if I'd been more suspicious earlier? Should I have recognized the warning signs of his manipulation? "I blame myself for not trusting my instincts," I said. "There were moments when something felt off about Vincent, but I ignored those feelings because I wanted you to be happy. I thought your happiness was more important than my concerns. And now? Now I know that protecting the people you love sometimes means making them unhappy in the short term. If I'd confronted Vincent earlier, you might have been angry with me, but you wouldn't have had to go through the trauma of discovering his betrayal while you were pregnant." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about that too, about how I ignored red flags because I wanted to believe Vincent was perfect. What kind of red flags? Little things. The way he talked about other people, especially women in business. How he never seemed genuinely interested in learning about our manufacturing processes, only in the financial aspects. The way he'd make decisions about our personal life without consulting me, then act like I was being unreasonable if I objected. I thought about Vincent's behavior at family dinners, the subtle put-downs disguised as jokes, the way he'd gradually positioned himself as the authority on everything from wine selection to investment strategies. Manipulative people are often very charming, I said. They have to be, or their manipulation wouldn't work. Vincent studied you, learned what you wanted to hear, and became that person. How do I make sure I don't fall for that again? You trust yourself, I said. You listen to your instincts. And you remember that real love doesn't require you to change who you are or abandon the people who've always supported you. Emma stirred in my arms, making tiny newborn sounds that seemed impossibly precious. Looking at her perfect little face, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing since Margaret's death. This child would grow up knowing she was loved and protected, surrounded by people who would always put her welfare ahead of their own interests. I have something for you, Sarah said, reaching into the bedside table drawer. She pulled out a small wrapped package and handed it to me. Inside was a photograph in a silver frame. The picture showed Margaret and me standing in front of the original Hartwell Industries warehouse, both of us young and hopeful and completely unaware of the challenges that lay ahead. I remembered the day it was taken. We'd just signed our first major contract and felt like we were on top of the world. I found it in Mom's old jewelry box, Sarah explained. I thought you should have it for your office, to remind you of what you and Mom built together. I felt tears prick my eyes as I studied the photograph. Margaret's smile was radiant, her hand resting protectively on her pregnant belly. We'd been so young, so naive about the complexities of business and parenthood and marriage, but we'd been united in our determination to build something lasting. Thank you, I said, my voice rough with emotion. This means more to me than you know. I know exactly what it means, Sarah said softly. It means that good people can build good things, even when bad people try to tear them down. 3 weeks later, I was back in my office, the framed photograph of Margaret and me prominently displayed on my desk. Sarah was home with Emma, adjusting to the rhythms of new motherhood and slowly beginning to review company reports again. Janet Morrison knocked on my door and entered with her usual efficient smile. Mr. Hartwell, there's someone here to see you. She says she's from the State Economic Development Office. The visitor turned out to be Rebecca Martinez, a program coordinator who specialized in family-owned businesses. She'd heard about Hartwell Industries through our attorney, who'd mentioned our successful prosecution of Vincent's crimes. We're always looking for examples of companies that have overcome significant challenges while maintaining their family values, Rebecca explained. Your story, how you protected your business and your family from internal threats, could be valuable for other business owners facing similar situations. I'm not sure our story is particularly inspiring, I said. We were almost destroyed by someone we trusted. We just got lucky that I discovered the problem before it was too late. But you didn't just get lucky, Rebecca insisted. You took proactive steps to investigate and document what was happening. You protected your evidence and built a case methodically. Most importantly, you prioritized the long-term welfare of your family and employees over short-term peace. I thought about her assessment. It was true that I could have ignored the financial discrepancies, could have rationalized away the suspicious behavior, could have chosen to believe Vincent's explanations rather than conducting a thorough investigation. What would you want from us? I asked. Just your willingness to share your experience with other family business owners. Maybe participate in a workshop. Tell your story to help others recognize the warning signs of internal fraud and manipulation. The idea appealed to me. If our painful experience could help even one other family avoid Vincent's brand of destruction, it would give meaning to everything we'd endured. Let me talk to my daughter, I said. If she's comfortable with it, we'd be happy to help. That evening, I sat on Sarah's couch watching her nurse Emma while we discussed Rebecca's proposal. The sight of my daughter caring for her child filled me with a contentment I hadn't felt in years. I think we should do it, Sarah said after I'd explained Rebecca's request. Other women need to know how to recognize the signs of financial abuse and manipulation. Vincent almost destroyed us, but we survived. Other families should know that survival is possible. It won't be easy talking publicly about what Vincent did. No, Sarah agreed. But it's important. And besides, I'm done being ashamed of Vincent's crimes. He's the one who should be ashamed, not us. I looked around Sarah's living room, taking in the family photographs on the mantel, the baby supplies neatly organized in baskets, the sense of peace that had settled over our lives since Vincent's removal. Emma was sleeping in her mother's arms, completely unaware of the storms that had raged around her before her birth. Your mother would be proud of you, I said, of your strength, your wisdom, your commitment to protecting Emma's future. She'd be proud of you too, Sarah replied. You saved our family, Dad. You saved everything she and you worked to build. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. A year ago, I'd been a lonely widower, watching my daughter slip away from me, helpless to prevent Vincent's systematic destruction of everything Margaret and I had created. Tonight, I was a grandfather, a partner in rebuilding my relationship with Sarah, and the protector of a family legacy that would continue for generations to come. Vincent had taught us painful lessons about trust and manipulation, about the importance of vigilance and the dangers of willful blindness. But more importantly, he'd reminded us of what really mattered: family, honesty, and the courage to fight for what's right. The company Margaret and I had built was safe, Sarah and Emma's future was secure, and Vincent was exactly where he belonged, paying the price for his choices while we lived in the peace he'd tried to steal from us. Justice, I'd learned, wasn't about revenge or getting even. It was about protecting the people you love and ensuring that good people could continue building good things, no matter how hard bad people tried to tear them down. Margaret's legacy lived on in our daughter and granddaughter. Vincent's legacy was a prison cell, and the knowledge that his greed had cost him everything that might have made his life meaningful. I knew which legacy I preferred. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.